By the time the Third Crusade had begun the long journey east to fight the so-called infidel and attempt to reclaim Jerusalem, which had fallen in 1187 to the Sultan Saladin, the crusading ideal had been in full force for over 90 years since Pope Urban II had preached the First Crusade. Of course, supposed holy war was much older than that, but for Christian Europe it had been Urban who had framed the idea of crusade in such a way that travelling thousands of miles to fight in blistering summer heat or suffer terribly in the freezing winters of the East seemed to make perfect sense. Killing fellow human beings was perfectly okay if it was done in the name of Jesus Christ, and after all, the Christians of the First Crusade were seeking to reclaim what was rightfully theirs, or so they thought, Jerusalem. Of course, there was no excusing the massacre of the Muslim population once Jerusalem had been taken in the summer of 1099. But for the Crusaders, these unfortunate men, women, and children of the Islamic faith were unbelievers, and they were simply cleansing the city. What did it matter if the Crusaders now waded ankle high in human blood? As repulsive as those scenes undoubtedly were, and they weren't the first of their kind during the Crusade, unfortunately, Urban had undoubtedly captured the imagination of Christian Europe, rich and poor alike. The Pope promised remission of sins to those who took the cross, and he played on the emotions of those who would listen to him, of whom there were many. Urban had heard tales from the Byzantine Emperor of how Christians in the East were being oppressed and slaughtered by the Seljuk Turks. Urban told the Council of Clermont, they, the Turks, have killed and captured many Christians and have destroyed the churches and devastated the Byzantine Empire. If you permit them to continue thus for a while with impurity, the faithful of God will be much more widely attacked by them. Urban's powerful words would have overwhelmed many and driven them to high emotion. His preachings were greeted with great enthusiasm as potential crusaders came pouring forward. The crusading ideal would be prominent throughout the Middle Ages, although it would begin to dwindle in the late 1200s. Although enthusiasm would be especially high in the century following the First Crusade, and would be something that popes like Innocent III hoped to exploit, it would give rise to some shocking and tragic scenes. Powerful orators like Urban II and Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most prominent churchmen of the mid 12th century, who played such a crucial role in recruiting for and promoting the Second Crusade, had a tremendous psychological impact on their audiences, as I indicated earlier. As ordinary men and women became swept up in their own religious ignorance, believing they were now off to fight in the name of their Saviour, they turned their vitriol on an enemy that was closer to home. Entirely innocent Jewish communities found themselves the target of the Crusaders' furious wrath, as men, women, and children of all ages were slaughtered in the lead up to both the First and Second Crusade. To his credit, Bernard of Clairvaux attempted to stop the horrific violence, knowing it was massively undermining his cause. There have been discussions over what was the main motivation for people to join a crusade, and there are, usually, two options given: genuine religious devotion or personal enrichment, which popes like Urban II made no pretense of hiding was a possibility from a crusade, or perhaps a combination of the two. However, it seems certain to me that there was an element of these Crusader armies who were simply out to eradicate non Christian peoples as best as they could. This is perhaps an uncomfortable truth that Christian historians today may not want to acknowledge. For leaders of the Crusades, whether they be emperors, kings, princes, or simply dukes or counts, there was one big question to answer when setting out on a crusade: how to control your army. You were marching and sailing across thousands of miles through various kingdoms where you could potentially create more than a few enemies if your men failed to behave, and the sheer numbers of the men at your disposal could be enormous. The likes of Richard the Lionheart and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, both leaders of the Third Crusade, would set out to their men in no uncertain terms what they expected in terms of behaviour. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden relates what Richard the Lionheart stated to his men who were travelling with him by sea. Richard, by the grace of God, King of England, and Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, and Count of Anjou, to all his subjects who are about to go by sea to Jerusalem, greeting. Know that we, by the common counsel of upright men, have made the laws here given. Whoever slays a man on board ship shall be bound to the dead man and thrown into the sea. But if he shall slay him on land, he shall be bound to the dead man and buried in the earth. If anyone, moreover, shall be convicted through lawful witnesses of having drawn a knife to strike another, or having struck him so as to draw blood, he shall lose his hand. But if he shall strike him with his fist without drawing blood, he shall be dipped 3 times into the sea. But if any one shall taunt or insult a comrade or charge him with hatred of God, as many times as he shall have insulted him, so many ounces of silver shall he pay. A robber, moreover, convicted of theft, shall be shorn like a hired fighter, and boiling tar shall be poured over his head, and feathers from a cushion shall be shaken out over his head, so that he may be publicly known, and at the first land where the ships put in, he shall be cast onto shore. Richard was well aware of the scale of the task that he was undertaking, and he knew he and his fellow crusaders faced a formidable foe in the shape of Saladin. To defeat the Sultan would require unity and discipline. Ultimately, Richard and the crusade would fall short of its end goal of retaking Jerusalem. But Richard made enough gains to win back some ground for the Christians in the Holy Land, and he certainly left an impression on his enemies. It was said that Muslim parents would tell naughty children that if they did not behave, then the King of England would get them. It seems likely that fear of Richard increased after the massacre of some 2,000 Muslim prisoners after the capture of Acre, having grown suspicious that Saladin was reneging on an agreement that had been reached with Richard. Stories of such ruthlessness would have spread far and wide and shocked more than a few, including members of Richard's own army, if you believe one Muslim chronicler named Bahar ad-Din. Whilst Richard's actions at Acre were undoubtedly brutal, they can be considered an act of war. If Saladin thought he could pull a fast one, then he had picked the wrong man to try and fool this time. Richard also had the practicalities of war to think about. Could he afford to cart around with him thousands of prisoners who would need to be fed and watered? The answer to that was clearly no. With this, Richard showed he knew exactly how to manage and control his army. His bravery and enormous skill, combined with his utter bloody mindedness, demonstrated why he was the ideal man to lead the Third Crusade. Like Richard the Lionheart, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa had also been a leader of the Third Crusade, but his time was cut short after he drowned attempting to cross a river. The manner of Frederick's death is somewhat mysterious, as there are various accounts of how he drowned, ranging from he fell off his horse whilst crossing the river, to that he had gone for a swim and simply got into trouble. At the time of the Crusade, Frederick was long in the tooth, aged in his late 60s, and having been emperor for over half his life. Writing to Saladin ahead of the Crusade, it was clear that Frederick was in defiant and confident mood. He demanded that the Sultan leave Jerusalem and surrender the lands he had taken and give them back to the Christians. Of course, Saladin paid little heed to these words, although he did respond to Frederick's message. Like Richard, Frederick was battle hardened and he had a wealth of experience to call upon, and he would have felt himself very capable of achieving victory, although fate proved to be against him. After his sudden death, most of his army returned home, dealing a significant blow to the long term hopes of the Crusade. Long before the Crusade, in the year 1158, Frederick prepared for a campaign in Italy. He outlined what he expected from his army and the standards they set by publishing 25 articles. Frederick demanded absolute discipline from his men, coming down harshly on crimes such as theft, assault, and murder. A convicted thief could expect to lose a hand, and a murderer to be hanged should his crime be proven. More pertinently to our question of Crusader discipline is that Frederick stated that none of his men was to set ablaze a house or village of some unsuspecting and innocent peasant. Crusades could make many enemies by inflicting such damage, which would, given the size of their armies, be on an enormous scale. As indicated earlier, the Third Crusade could potentially have had a different outcome had Frederick Barbarossa lived and seen the crusade through. Alas, it wasn't to be, and the other great king on that crusade, Philip II of France, clearly had other things on his mind as he abandoned Richard the Lionheart after the capture of Acre. So, what did it take to lead a crusade? Well, crusades could overcome periods of chaos, as the First Crusade had shown after the fiasco with Peter the Hermit and his oddball army. And the First Crusade had also shown that it didn't necessarily have to be led by a king or emperor to be successful. The Second Crusade had also shown this, as it had been led by two kings and had proved to be a total failure. A crusade was such a brutal undertaking that an iron discipline was required even to survive the ordeal, never mind achieving the end goal, whether that be the capture or recapture of Jerusalem or some other lost land or territory. After the Third Crusade, Christian holy war began to take on a new dimension. The Fourth Crusade, to the despair of Innocent III, was distinctly self serving and ended with the sacking of Constantinople, a Christian city. Crusades would move closer to home in the 13th century, as a war was declared against heresy in southern France and against paganism in northern Europe. War against the Islamic presence in Spain and what is now Portugal had been going on for centuries, and the Christians of Iberia were now winning their war of reconquest. The success of the Crusades in the Holy Land, however, was ultimately limited. The First Crusade had achieved its goal, but after that it would become a long, hard struggle for the Crusader states to even survive. To be a triumphant crusader in the East, in such alien conditions, you needed to have the character of a warrior, in the fashion of Godfrey of Bouillon or Richard the Lionheart, and there weren't too many of those. It's not really a surprise then that the Christians enjoyed greater success in their wars closer to home.